Hey guys, Palsteron here, and today let's talk about the Molten Shell and Val Molten Shell nerfs for 3.21, why they're problematic for a ton of builds, and how we can adapt to them. First up, if you're somebody who's like 6 portal is my defense, I don't really care, right? I personally do care. I will come from this at like a middling position. There's people who play like medium core, basically. They want to be incredibly tanky on soft core, and they're fine with sacrificing certain things to get there. And then there's people who basically are fine with being extremely squishy. Even if they had like 1 point that made them double as tanky, they would still probably up for damage. And all these playstyles are fine, right? I'll take this. I'm somewhere in between. I really like my movement speed, my AoE, my damage, but I really don't like dying. So what are the Molten Shell nerfs exactly? So Molten Shell used to give you up to 10,000 shield, depending on your armor. For a full 10,000 shield, you used to need 50,000 armor, which you still do, by the way, but your maximum shield is now only 5,000. And that is a big deal because you still need 50,000, but now you get this here. We're going to talk about why that is kind of a problem later. Now, other than that, a lot of people are missing that Val Molten Shell also got nerfed. And Val Molten Shell used to be this button that you basically press and it makes you basically semi-immune. And now what it does is Val Molten Shell is now basically the old Molten Shell, right? The only thing that changed that I want to say is you used to be able to get up to 30,000 Val Molten Shell, but I'm pretty sure that used to need 100,000 armor, which it was kind of hard to get for a ton of builds, but still for the builds that could get it, Val Molten Shell was a crazy thing to get. At 50,000 armor, you're basically cutting your shield from 15,000 to 10,000. Now, why is this so big? Well, Molten Shell is one of the most played skills in the game. It's actually top 3 alongside Flame Dash, which is a movement skill, and Determination, which basically accompanies Molten Shell. So this is not a small issue, and I'm pretty sure even if I went to something like Calandra, we would probably see very similar results. In fact, exactly the same result here was actually number 3, 60% again. And that's just mind-boggling, right? So it won't just be 60% of players that played Molten Shell. Chances, it's just 60% of builds. Chances are at some point you're going to play a build that had armor in it, maybe even all of them. A big problem for armor builds as well going forward will be elemental defenses. And this is going to be mostly a problem for builds that lean in heavily into armor, that basically used Molten Shell as an elemental defense as well, right? Because armor only protects you from physical hits. So unless you are like a Juggernaut, for example, that is not going to fly that well. And note, like, Unbreakable after this patch will also be a ton stronger. It was already pretty insane. Another huge problem actually is that Determination going forward, or in general, getting another aura in will be harder to do from here on out, because they just removed not only the Determination mana reservation efficiency, they also removed Grace, which often accompanied Determination. And sure, you could say there's a new mana mastery, 12% mana reservation. Okay, not that many people actually take mana nodes. So what that would mean is you would have to invest 3 points for 12% mana reservation unless you're already taking 1, right? So that's 3 points, that's 4% per, that is incredibly weak. At that point, you might as well take a small cluster jewel, which a lot of builds really don't have any points for. Now, how will this affect builds? Obviously, I can only guess here, but this is my prediction. Builds with more access to armor are still going to run Molten Shell. It's going to be weaker, but it's obviously still better than the other alternatives. More on that a little bit later. But what they will be looking for is something to compensate the loss in elemental damage reduction, and that will be mostly from max res. So I think what that will mean is builds that felt cozy on Molten Shell before against elemental damage might now opt to spec into Prismatic Skin, or if they can't path, they're at least Anointed. And there's also going to be some new interesting ways to do this. Now, there is a new maximum elemental resistance mastery here, actually, that gives you +1 maximum res if you have reserved life and mana. You can pretty easily do that if you have the gem sockets for it. You can put like a clarity level 1 or like a precision level 1 on your life with arrogance. That should be pretty easy to do. And other than that, I think there was one more new one somewhere. But yeah, it was the +1 maximum resistances if equipped helmet, body armor, gloves, and boots all have armor. So that's also nice to kind of compensate for that a little bit. Overall, still going to be a nerf, but you have to take what you get. Now, for builds with less armor access, they will have to probably look into Fizz taken as. Now, the thing is, for example, I took my EA Ballista here as an example. Not the tankiest build, not the squishiest build, somewhere in between, right? We are sitting at 24,000 armor. Now, I'm looking at a lot of League Start POBs, and a lot of right-side trees or trees that don't really have much investment into armor will be looking at 15,000 to like maybe 30,000 armor or somewhere in between. And that's only while you have a Granite Flask up, right? You have to also put that into account. Sometimes you don't have it up always. Against bosses, it might have pretty bad uptime unless you're a Pathfinder. Now, these builds really have to reconsider what they're doing, because Molten Shell, with the buff that it currently gives you, is hardly competitive with a Steel Skin or, for example, an Immortal Call. With the same armor that you had before, you're now only going to have 2,500 reduction, which is basically Steel Skin at level 20 versus 5,000 that you had before. So that is quite a problem. Now, what do I mean with Fizz taken as? What I mean as an example here is Lightning Coil. Lightning Coil is a chest that I've been using on quite a bit of builds. I get asked a lot why. Basically, I use it because of this line, 50% of physical damage from hits taken as lightning damage. Now, 50% is quite a lot, and you might have actually missed it because it got buffed in 3.19, where it was still 30% and it got buffed to 50%. Basically, ever since then, I've been trying on a lot of my Ranger kind of builds on the right side of the tree to replace armor completely and get more into this kind of physical damage reduction. I'll tell you why in a second. Basically, Lightning Coil is incredibly strong right now, but not everybody can use it, so let's look at some other options or some other sources of that stat. Actually, one thing I should clarify is, why is physical damage taken as elemental so good, right? It doesn't matter whether it's lightning, fire, cold. It is because they run against your resistances, right? And everybody has 75 resistance at least. If you have more, it gets better and better. But let's just assume 75% on a lightning coil, right? So 50% from hits taken as lightning damage. You have 50 times 0.75 because it runs against your resistances. That is basically like 37.5% physical damage reduction. It's not technically the same because there is a very interesting hierarchy in terms of defensive layers, but basically this is just to kind of show what this does. So you take 37% less damage from physical hits, which is incredibly strong. Now, you might say, well, if I look at the physical damage reduction here, armor actually gives 70%, even at 24,000. Well, that's true, but let's look at bigger hits. So the thing is, in PoB, if we look at bosses, right, how good armor is really depends on how big the hit is. Because the way the armor formula is set up, it gets worse the bigger an enemy hits you, which is kind of a problem against one-shots. So on average here, PoB puts in 2,320 against like a Guardian or Pinnacle boss. Let's just say an enemy actually hits you for a chunky hit, right? Let's say 6,000. Let's see what happens to your physical damage reduction, right? On armor, your physical damage reduction now goes down to 47%. So with Reserving Determination, having armor on gear, having a Granite Flask with increased armor roll, we're already almost where just a Lightning Coil would get you. So yeah, it doesn't get worse with bigger hits, which is very good against something like bosses, for example, that hit you for a hefty chunk, or even some of the map mods like vulnerability, stuff like that. But it is harder to spec into. So let's talk about some options. So what are your options? You have a Helmet Prefix Craft. That is basically an Unveil from Ashling. And you also have an Eldritch Implicit that can give you physical damage taken as. It's 8 and then I think 8 again, or 8 and 7, something like that. There is a Delve Helmet Suffix. Actually, you can get this fractured on your helmet. There is Purity of Element Watcher's Eyes. The problem here is obviously that you have to then use a Purity of Elements, so that is kind of a big investment. But if you have, for example, Watcher's Eye with 2 Purity of Elements mods, maybe it's actually worth it. There's also Chieftain, and by no means am I going to tell you to run Chieftain, because it didn't really get any love this patch. I just want to point out just how good Tassalio is. The main problem is you don't want to run Chieftain. If you're on Juggernaut, you already have Unbreakable, so you're going to be fine. And on Berserker, you probably lost your will to live anyways. So I'm not saying that you have to get like a Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Flesh for this. I just put it here for completion's sake. Ashling mod. Oh yeah, this is the body armor, actually, the new Ashling mod on body armor, which you can also craft, obviously. I should probably put that here, actually. Then we have Taste of Hate and Flask Effect. This is going to be a mainstay for, I think, a ton of builds. Taste of Hate can get up to 15% of physical damage from hits taken as cold damage. The big thing about this is also that you can use it with Pathfinder and increased flask effect. Yes, Nature's Boon only gives 30% increased effect to magic flasks. However, the small nodes still give increased effect across the board, and you can also get it from the passive tree. And then you can also get it as a shield corruption, for example, on a unique shield. Also, something that I actually forgot now that we're talking about shields is a really strong shield here is Dawnbreaker. Dawnbreaker also has the stat. I think it goes up to 20% of physical damage taken as fire damage. I'm pretty sure that is the roll range. So if you, for example, get like this shield with also the corruption on top, let's do it right here. Physical physical damage taken as. You can see Cold, Fire, Lightning, and Chaos. Talking about Fizz as Chaos, that is also a very strong defensive layer. Not just for CI builds. Obviously, if you're Chaos Inoculation, this is straight up like less physical damage taken. But even if you're capped Chaos Res, and you might say, well, I'm usually not Chaos Res capped. Well, you might want to look into that again. There's actually two things. The first one I couldn't find, but I remember there's going to be a new map mod that basically gets physical damage as extra chaos damage to mobs, which is going to be rough. And there's also going to be the crystals from Rare Monster Modifier. The purple crystals are now going to be chaos damage as well. But I digress. Basically, if you have capped chaos res, this is really good. Physical taken as chaos. And if you're CI, it's straight up insane. Now, there is a mod on rares and on rare chests and helmets that I could find right here. I think it's a hunter mod, actually. Yeah, physical damage from hits taken as chaos damage. It's also, yeah, it's also down here on the helmet. For poison bow builds, you have Dark Scorn, which gives a whooping 25% of physical damage taken as chaos damage. And there's also a mastery that maybe went a little bit under the radar. Here, it's an Armor and Energy Shield mastery. 10% of physical damage from hits taken as chaos damage. And there's some other options, obviously. You can lean more into endurance charges. What that means for builds on the left side here, you will see them very often take maybe endurance charges more, or what you will see is also on small cluster jewels. You will see people just take Enduring Composure, and they already did, but it's even better now. When it comes to raw physical damage reduction, for example, through endurance charges, though, it is very hard to just have that as a one-stop shop, because so you're going to have to supplement that with something if you actually want to be tanky. There's obviously going to be Immortal Call and Steel Skin, which are now going to be your replacement for Molten Shell on some builds. Especially Immortal Call actually gets quite a bad rep. Even if you don't have any endurance charges to consume, it is still incredibly strong. Now, let's say it's a level 1 Immortal Call, actually. You're still looking at 25% less elemental damage taken, less physical damage taken, whereas Steel Skin gives you more of like a shield at level 20 and at 21, I think it's like 2.4k. So sometimes this is even going to be more of a shield than Molten Shell. It really depends. If you already have some kind of generic duration in your build, that's going to be even better. Now, you can also hope that Progenesis is enough. If you're a Pathfinder, that's actually pretty realistic, especially if you have something like Petrified Blood and good support for it. And you can also still go Armor. And even on Armor builds, if you have like this 15 to 20 to 25,000 Armor scenario, I might actually look into Immortal Call now that Molten Shell got nerfed, especially if you have a little bit of endurance charge support, for example, with Enduring Composure. One important piece of the puzzle I kind of forgot to mention, by the way, is if you want to be really tanky, you can actually supplement armor with physical taken as, because armor actually gets better with physical taken as, right? So if you think about armor gets worse the bigger the hit you take is, but armor is only for physical hits. So if you convert some of that damage to elemental damage, right, the physical hit will get smaller and your armor will get more efficient. So that's also an option if you, for example, on hardcore, but then you probably already know that. So what does that mean in conclusion? Well, Armor and Molten Shell is still incredibly strong. You'll still see a lot of builds with Determination. You'll still see a lot of builds with Molten Shell. Nobody is going to doubt that. Val Molten Shell is also going to still be pressed. Nothing really changes there, but they still got nerfed. And I think that was maybe a good thing. Overall, I don't like being less tanky, but also if you have a skill that gets played by 60% of people on softcore, like a defensive skill that gets played by 60% people on softcore, that is quite insane. But what it does mean for armor builds, they might look into getting a little bit more max res. Now, thankfully, they actually put some max res support in here. Maybe they already anticipated it. You can get +1 from the Reservation Mastery and also +1 from the Armor Mastery now. What this nerf does mean, though, is that there's other options that are more interesting now. For example, as I said, Lightning Coil, physical damage taken as stacking. And there is obviously also physical taken as Chaos, which now also got new support on the passive tree, 10% here. If you're, for example, a poison bow build, especially with something like Dark Scorn. I'm overall still pretty hopeful for defense changes right here. I hope your takeaway was not that you should just don't scale any armor at all and you should just not do anything for your physical defense. That's definitely not true. Now, a trend in the last few leagues, in my eyes at least, has been that physical damage as extra LE has actually gotten a lot more ridiculous, and the physical damage has been toned down a little bit ever since Arch Nemesis rares got nerfed. But still, if you want to have a well-rounded character, you should definitely look into one of these. Maybe you could learn a thing or two. Since I still don't have a slogan, see you next time.